You just built a full P-51 wing section in under a quarter of the time it takes our best crew. The stopwatch clicked. The factory fell silent. Ilara Hayes' hands were still shaking when her foreman, Mr. Vernon, leaned over the polished aluminum wing and muttered, "That can't be right." He tapped the timer again as if to make it lie. 3 hours and 17 minutes. "Hayes," he said, "you just built a full P-51 wing section in under a quarter of the time it takes our best crew." Every riveter nearby froze mid-motion. The factory line had never stopped this way before, not even when the siren sounded for air raids. Ilara stepped back, her face smeared with graphite and oil. She thought she was in trouble. "Did I do something wrong?" Vernon didn't answer. He ran his hand along the row of rivets, each one perfectly flush, uniform, flawless. "You skipped steps, didn't you?" he said. "You had to." Ilara bit her lip. She couldn't admit it. Not yet. Not that she'd broken protocol. Not that she'd clamped the spars before the alignment check. Not that she'd redrawn the drill grid herself after noticing the template was slightly off. "I followed the book," she said quietly. Vernon stared at her, half suspicious, half amazed. Around them, the thunder of hammers and the hiss of air compressors resumed the heartbeat of the North American aviation plant in Inglewood, California, 1943. Tens of thousands of workers, mostly women, were turning sheets of metal into legends. The P-51 Mustang, the long-range escort fighter that kept bombers alive over Europe. But that day, in that corner of the plant, one woman had just done something that shouldn't have been possible. Vernon turned to the clock again. "You built this wing in 3 hours, he said slowly, his voice changing from accusation to awe. "Hayes, that's impossible." He called over an inspector. The wing went through tests, pressure check, rivet alignment, structural integrity. Each result came back perfect. Ilara watched in silence, trying to calm her heartbeat. All she'd done, she thought, was fix something obvious. The templates didn't line up right. No one questioned it. They just blamed the workers for being slow. So, she changed the process quietly, efficiently, and the result spoke for itself. When the last test passed, Vernon looked up at her and said the words that would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. "You didn't just save time, you just built a miracle." The next day, her section chief reported the anomaly to headquarters. They thought it was a fluke, but by the end of the week, other women on the line began copying her technique, calling it the Hayes clamp. None of them knew it yet, but her unapproved idea would spread to every Mustang factory in the country. It would cut assembly times by 70%. It would help deliver the planes that escorted bombers to Berlin. And decades later, when historians tried to trace who first rewrote the rulebook of wartime production, they found her name scribbled in pencil at the bottom of a blueprint next to a single note that said, "Clamp early, trust your hands." By the summer of 1943, the war wasn't just being fought in the skies, it was being fought in the factories. Every minute, every rivet, every sheet of aluminum mattered. At North American Aviation, the orders from Washington were brutal in their simplicity. 500 P-51 Mustangs per month. No excuses. The escort fighters were the difference between bomber crews coming home or vanishing into smoke over Germany. Ilara Hayes knew none of that when she first walked through the factory gates. She was just 22, a farm girl from Oklahoma who had taken a train west after her brother shipped out with the 8th Air Force. The war had taken him, and now it had taken her too, just in a different uniform. Inside the factory, the world became rhythm and noise. The bark of foremen, the hiss of air hoses, the clang of metal molds. Heat shimmered over the rows of partially assembled Mustangs. Overhead, banners shouted in bold red letters, "Speed is life. Slow hands cost lives." Ilara worked on the wing line, where each section demanded precision. Hundreds of rivets aligned to within fractions of an inch. 12 hours per section was the standard. The schedule was relentless, but delays haunted the line. Templates didn't fit right, parts warped from heat, and engineers blamed the riveters for being too slow. Ilara didn't buy it. She had a sharp eye for rhythm, for inefficiency. It was a skill learned from years waiting tables back home, seeing where a room slowed down, predicting what needed to happen before someone even asked. Every evening, When the whistle blew and the line went quiet, Elara stayed behind for a few minutes. She'd trace her fingers over the blueprints, following the lines, the angles, the rivet patterns. Something about them didn't add up. The process was beautiful, but wasteful. Designed for caution, not for speed. "Keep your head down, Hayes," her friend Lena warned. "You start asking questions, they'll ship you back to Kansas." But Elara couldn't stop thinking. If the wing could be braced differently, if two templates could be pre-aligned before the first drill, the entire process could collapse into a single fluid motion. She wasn't an engineer. She wasn't supposed to think that way, but the idea burned in her mind. Outside, across the horizon, the glow of Los Angeles blurred with the stars. Somewhere across the ocean, her brother might be flying a plane built in this very hangar. That thought drove her harder than any propaganda poster ever could. One night, as the graveyard shift began, Elara tightened her bandana and whispered, "There has to be a faster way." The air smelled of oil and courage. The roar of compressors was the sound of war itself. A war not of bullets and bombs, but of time. And time, Elara Hayes decided, was a weapon America could win with. The North American aviation plant wasn't just a factory. It was a living machine. More than 40,000 men and women clocked in every day, guided by a single unspoken truth. The faster they worked, the sooner the war would end. For Elara Caldwell, every shift began the same way. She'd pass through the gates under a cloud of cigarette smoke and sunlight. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. The hammering of rivets, the high-pitched whine of drills, the rhythmic thud of boots on concrete. Rows of P-51 Mustang fuselages sat suspended from cranes, their wings skeletal, their silver skins half-formed. The Mustang was fast, agile, and deadly, but only if it could be built fast enough to keep up with the war. Elara worked in Section B4, the lower wing spar team. 12 hours, 2 shifts, and over 4,000 rivets for a single section. The challenge was precision. If a single bolt or rivet was misaligned, the whole wing could warp in flight. "Keep your pace, Hayes," her supervisor barked one day. "Don't rush perfection." She almost laughed. "Then why are there clocks on every wall?" That night, Elara started writing in a small spiral notebook she kept tucked in her coveralls. Not diary entries, but numbers, patterns. She tracked how long each process took, how often templates had to be adjusted, where delays clustered. She noticed something strange. The alignment jigs designed to hold wing spars in place weren't consistent. A 1/8-inch variance appeared every third frame. It was microscopic, but it forced every riveter to re-drill holes, costing nearly an hour per wing. When she told the engineers, they brushed her off. "It's within tolerance," one said. "Tolerance," she muttered to herself, "is how mistakes survive." The next morning, she began experimenting. Tiny adjustments, subtle tweaks in clamping order, a reordering of tasks that shaved off seconds here, minutes there. It wasn't rebellion yet, but it was the spark of it. Around her, the plant thundered on. From the catwalks above, banners read, "The Arsenal of Democracy." But in the maze of steel and sweat, Elara Hayes was starting to think that democracy's real weapon wasn't a machine or a general. It was a woman with a wrench, a notebook, and an idea no one had asked her to have. The idea came to Elara not in a flash of genius, but in frustration. It was past midnight, the factory air thick with heat and exhaustion. She slammed the rivet gun down on the bench, earning a glare from the foreman. "Problem." "Hayes." "Yeah," she snapped before she could stop herself. "This jig's the problem. We're fighting it instead of using it." The process was broken, and she knew it. When the shift ended, she stayed behind, studying the alignment rig. And then it hit her. The problem wasn't the people or the pace, it was the order of the steps. Every worker was trained to follow the manual. Mount the wing, check alignment, drill, rivet, then brace. But Elara realized the jig actually caused misalignment once the rivets went in, forcing every section to be redone. What if she could lock the spars in place before drilling? It went against every rule in the book. The manual warned that premature clamping could warp the frame, but Elara had been studying the metal. She knew it could take the pressure. So, she tried it. The next night, while her section chief took a smoke break, She repositioned the clamps early, securing the wing spars tight before the measurement step. Then she drilled. The bit sliced cleanly through perfect alignment from start to finish. When she added the rivets, every hole matched without resistance. She ran her fingers along the metal, smooth, perfect, seamless. It took her less than half the usual time. By dawn, she had done what the manual said couldn't be done. She'd built a full section solo in under 4 hours. When the inspector came by, he stared at the work. "You double-team this?" "No," Ilara said. "Just me." He looked again, frowned, and checked his clipboard. "You're not cleared to do solo assembly." Ilara's stomach tightened. "Then I'll deny it if anyone asks." But word spread. Within 2 days, the other women on her line were trying the same method. They called it the Ilara clamp. Half joking, half defiant. The name stuck. Her supervisor, Mr. Vernon, finally pulled her aside. "You've been changing procedures without approval," he said. "Do you know what that means?" "It means the wings fit," Ilara replied. "And the planes fly." Vernon didn't answer right away. "If this goes wrong," he said quietly, "it's my head. If it goes right," she countered, "it's your promotion." Vernon smirked despite himself. "You're dangerous, Hayes." "No," Ilara said, picking up her rivet gun again. "Just fast." In that dim, humming factory filled with smoke and steel, something had shifted. A single act of defiance had become innovation, and soon that small act would ripple across every Mustang plant in America. By the fall of 1943, Ilara Hayes's unapproved shortcut had spread beyond her corner of the North American aviation plant. Line chiefs in Kansas City and Dallas had started hearing whispers about the girl who cut build time in half. Engineers called it a rumor, but foremen quietly copied her method anyway. The war didn't care about paperwork, it cared about results, and Ilara's fix worked. When her section's numbers hit record highs, 50% faster output, 0 structural faults, the higher-ups took notice. But instead of a medal, Ilara got a summons. "You modified the assembly sequence," an engineer told her in a meeting. "That's a violation of Navy 124, a production protocols." Ilara folded her arms. "Then your protocols are losing the war." A stunned silence followed. One supervisor muttered, "You're a riveter, not an engineer." Ilara looked him dead in the eye. Then maybe the engineer should come down to the line once in a while. She was reprimanded, of course, officially written up for deviation from standard manufacturing procedure. Unofficially, they doubled her shift quota. Within days, though, her fix was quietly approved without her name on the report. The memo simply read, "Revised clamping and pre-drill alignment procedure authorized across Mustang wing assembly lines." But Ilara didn't care about credit. All she cared about was speed and survival. By Christmas, the first Mustangs built with her illegal method were reaching the front lines. The difference was immediate. Pilots reported smoother handling, tighter wings, fewer vibration issues at high speed. Maintenance crews called the new wings bullet straight. One test pilot wrote in his logbook, "Feels like it was built by a pilot, not a pencil." Ilara's fix, a few clamps, and a change of sequence had multiplied into thousands of hours saved, and hundreds of planes built ahead of schedule. At night, when the plant finally fell silent, she'd walk past the assembly rows and rest her hand on the cold metal skin of a completed Mustang. She'd think about her brother somewhere over Europe, maybe flying one of these very planes. The men who fought the war never knew the woman who had given their plane its wings. The newspapers called it America's miracle of production. But in the dim corners of the factory floor, the truth was simpler. America's victory was being built by hands like hers, women who broke the rules because the rules were too slow. War is math. Every general knows it. Every factory worker learns it the hard way. And for Ilara Hayes, the math of victory was written in hours, rivets, and lives. Before her illegal method, a single P-51 Mustang wing took 12 hours to assemble. Afterward, it took just under 3. That meant 4 times as many wings, 4 times as many planes, and hundreds of bomber crews who would live to see another dawn. The system around those numbers, the logistics, the discipline, The coordination was America's true genius. At North American Aviation, productivity rose 40% in just 6 months. Scrap rates dropped by a third. The engineers didn't want to admit that a young woman with no degree had rewritten their efficiency model. But the pilots didn't care about titles. They cared about results. Letters began to circulate back from the front. One came from an airman named Lieutenant James Ace Boyd, who had flown Mustangs over Germany. "These wings don't shake under flak anymore," he wrote. "You can feel it in your bones." Someone back home figured it out. Elara heard that letter read aloud on the factory floor by her supervisor. He didn't mention her name, but when he looked up, she saw his eyes flicker. It was acknowledgement enough. The math was staggering. By 1944, American factories were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes. And behind every one of them were small acts like hers, unsanctioned fixes, dangerous shortcuts, desperate improvements, born of exhaustion and courage. "War doesn't reward patience," Elara told her crew one night. "It rewards whoever finishes first." And right. Her team learned her rhythm. The line began to move like a heartbeat, steady, relentless, alive. Then one night, a man from the War Production Board came through on inspection. He noticed Elara's section was outpacing the others by miles. "How?" he asked. Her foreman hesitated. Elara met his gaze and said simply, "We stopped following the book." The inspector scribbled something on his clipboard. He didn't reprimand her. He just said, "Keep doing whatever you're doing." That was the unspoken truth of the American war machine. Innovation didn't always come from the top. Sometimes it came from the bottom of the ladder, from a woman covered in sweat and dust, daring to think faster than the system that built her tools. Elara knew her fix would never bear her name, but the math didn't lie. Every P-51 Mustang that thundered across the sky was proof of what happened when ordinary people refused to stay ordinary. The factories had become battlefields of their own, and in them, Elara Hayes had already won her war. By early 1944, the first Mustangs built with Elara Caldwell's illegal process were arriving in England, sleek, silver, and lethal. At the 4th Fighter Group airfield near Debden, England, ground crews marveled at the new planes. "These birds don't rattle anymore," one mechanic said. Captain James Boyd, the same pilot who had written the letter Elara's team heard, was among the first to fly one of these new P-51Ds. On the side of his aircraft, painted in bold red script, was the name Oklahoma Rose. He didn't know that somewhere across the ocean in a noisy California factory, a woman named Elara had built the very wings, keeping him alive. March 1944. The mission: escort a formation of B-17 seconds deep into Germany, Leipzig. It was a suicide run on paper, 500 miles one way. As the sun rose over the English countryside, Boyd's squadron took off. At 15,000 feet, they met the bombers. For 2 hours, the sky remained quiet. Then came the swarm. Messerschmitts, dozens of them. The Luftwaffe had come to kill. "Bandits 11 high," Boyd shouted over the radio. The German fighters dove straight through the formation. AB-17 burst into flames. The air turned to chaos. But the new Mustangs moved differently. Boyd's plane didn't shudder in a dive. The wings held firm, vibration-free, even under brutal G-forces. He banked hard, looped under a Messerschmitt, and fired a perfect burst. 2 seconds later, the German fighter exploded mid-air. "Good kill, Oklahoma Rose," a voice crackled through the radio. Boyd grinned grimly. Thank the folks who built her. The dogfight lasted 19 minutes. When it was over, 12 German fighters were down. Not a single Mustang lost. Back at base, Boyd climbed out of his cockpit, still shaking from adrenaline. He ran a hand over the wing, feeling the smooth, tight seams where other planes would have warped or buckled. He whispered, "Whoever built this knew what they were doing." That night, in his after-action report, Boyd wrote a single line that would later appear in Stars and Stripes. "The P-51 isn't a plane. It's a promise." Rosie would never read it. But across the ocean, her shift kept going. She was tightening clamps, drilling rivets, and shaving minutes, never knowing that somewhere in Europe, her invisible fingerprints were holding a pilot's life together. By the winter of 1944, The North American aviation plant had become something almost mythic. Elara Hayes was no longer just a riveter. She had been quietly promoted to shift supervisor. The factory floor never went dark. "If Hayes says it fits, one of the men joked. It wasn't disrespect, it was faith. Then came December. News from the front was grim. The Battle of the Bulge. Reports came through the factory loudspeakers. "We've lost air cover." The Luftwaffe had thrown everything it had left. "Then we don't stop," Elara said. "Not for anything." That night, she made a decision. One the engineers would have called impossible. Her team would complete a full set of wings before dawn. It had never been done, not even close. For the next 9 hours, the factory became a storm. No one went home. At 4:42 a.m., the final rivet went in. The wing, flawless, seamless, gleaming, rolled down the line. One of the men handed Elara a cup of black coffee and said, "You just beat the clock, boss." She smiled faintly. "No, we just beat time." 3 weeks later, that very Mustang wing, serial number 47B311, was logged in the shipment manifest to the 352nd Fighter Group in Belgium. It would fly in January when Allied planes finally returned to the sky. History wouldn't remember the faces on that line, but it would remember what they built and what it meant when it arrived. Somewhere over the Ardennes, an American pilot would look out his canopy and whisper, "We are back." And he'd never know that the reason he could fly again was because a handful of factory workers, led by a woman who broke the rules, refused to sleep until they'd beaten the war at its own game. By early 1945, Elara Hayes' hands were permanently scarred. The doctors called it industrial fatigue. Elara called it the cost of winning. Her crew had broken every record the plant had ever set. But breaking rules, even in wartime, came with enemies. One afternoon, an inspector from Washington arrived. "Who authorized these procedural modifications?" he demanded. Elara didn't answer at first. Then she said quietly, "We did." The man blinked. "You mean you went around the engineering board?" "No," Elara replied. "We went through the war." The inspector stared at her, then scribbled something on his notes and left. A week later, the order came down. Reinstate official assembly procedures effective immediately. That night, she sat alone, staring at the unfinished skeletons of P-51 seconds. Then she heard footsteps. It was her foreman, Vernon. He held a letter in his hand. "This came for you," he said. "Overseas." Elara opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single page, smudged and worn. "Dear Elara, I don't know if this will reach you, but I wanted to say thank you. Your plane saved my life. We made it back from Berlin. The Mustang held together even after we took hits. Whoever built her, tell them she's perfect. Tell them we came home because of her. Lieutenant James Boyd, 4th Fighter Group." Elara folded the letter slowly. Vernon said quietly, "They can take your method off the books, but they can't take that." The next morning, the factory bell rang. Elara picked up her rivet gun. The orders were still in place, the old procedures, but her team didn't follow them. Not anymore. When the inspectors came by, they found everything in perfect order, at least on paper. But the wings were still being built Elara's way. That was the real secret of American industry. Defiance disguised as duty. Innovation hidden behind obedience. May 1945. The factory floor was silent for the first time in 4 years. The war was over. Elara Caldwell sat on a wooden crate near the end of the production line. Her foreman, Vernon, walked up beside her. "You should be proud," he said. "We did it." Elara nodded slowly. 15,000 ways to come home. A few weeks later, at a plant ceremony, a tall man with a limp approached Elara. "You worked the wing line, right?" he asked. She nodded. He took her hand and said softly, "Then I owe you my life. My Mustang brought me home after my engine caught fire over Bremen. I thought she was going to break apart, but she didn't. She held together." Elara's voice caught in her throat. "That's good to hear," she said finally. Years later, Elara still kept working, teaching new generations of mechanics and engineers. She started every class the same way. Don't let anyone tell you rules can't be rewritten. Every rule in a factory is written in pencil, and every pencil has an eraser. When the local paper interviewed her, She said, "It wasn't when Germany surrendered. It was when the first plane we built came back, when we knew it worked." Her illegal method eventually made its way into official textbooks on industrial design. Historians would call it the Hayes process for what it represented: courage through innovation. At the Smithsonian today, a single P-51 wing is displayed with a plaque that reads, "Built by women of the home front, proof that freedom's strength is not in fear, but in imagination." Ilara's story remains the girl who refused to follow the book and ended up writing a new one. Because in the end, America didn't just win the war with guns, bombs, or tanks. It won because of people like Ilara Hayes, who looked at a broken system, picked up a wrench, and made it faster, stronger,